We're now living in a world where we just have such an easy escape hatch in that we carry around these devices, and it's so easy to distract ourselves basically, that I feel like we've almost developed an incapacity to be bored, to just sit with that.
Our response to boredom, our relationship to boredom has a lot to do with, I think, our comfort with our own mind. And so, one of the things about boredom is we tend to get bored when there's not stuff for us to do. And when there's not stuff for us to do, we are confronted inevitably by our own mind.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dharma Lab. I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Richie Davidson, one of the world's eminent neuroscientists, and I am Cortland Dahl. And today we're going to talk about something I think probably everybody maybe experiences a lot, which is boredom and restlessness. I have such vivid memories of this. I was, if we had our normal distribution of where people fall and how easily bored they are, I'm pretty sure would have been an outlier in that I was so easily bored as a kid. I was just one of these kids who could not sit still. And I have vivid memories, I think especially of like the summer, of sitting at home on a summer afternoon, desperately trying to call my friends and see if anybody wanted to come and hang out. And there's like nothing on TV. This is back in the days where you couldn't get everything on demand, and it was just like boring daytime TV shows. And I remember just this feeling of like crawling out of my skin. I just like literally, could not sit there if we had no mobile phones. This is long before the iPhone and smartphones, but I would have, I would have done anything to like have had something like that. And now it's kind of amazing. After years of meditation, I would say if one thing has changed in my life, it's my relation. I kind of feel like I'm immune to boredom now, and there's a whole long practice history with that. But I thought we could just maybe start by talking about boredom, because we're now living in a world where we just have such an easy escape hatch in that we carry around these devices, and it's so easy to distract ourselves basically, that I feel like we've almost developed an incapacity to be bored, to just sit with that. And so maybe we could just talk about a scientific perspective. We can both share our personal experiences, but let me just kick it over to you, Richie, and see any opening thoughts, and then we can dive into it more deeply.
Yeah, I know. I think boredom is an interesting topic.
It is. That's the weird thing. It's strangely interesting. Nobody
Yeah, it is
boring is
strangely,
boredom is not boring.
yeah. Um, and I think that it is this phenomenon that has been deeply impacted by changes in the fabric of our society, by the development of technology and so forth. And, I think boredom and our response to boredom, our relationship to boredom has a lot to do with, I think, our comfort with our own mind. And so one of the things about boredom is we tend to get bored when there's not stuff for us to do. And when there's not stuff for us to do, we are confronted inevitably by our own mind. That is the one thing that we can't get rid of, although people try with like drugs and other ways to dull their mind. But, under most circumstances, we have our minds. And from a neuroscientific perspective, we know that when a person is not engaged in a demanding activity that really requires their mental resources, what is active is a mode of brain function that we call the default mode. And the default mode is mostly associated with self-referential thought. And by self-referential thought, we mean the narrative that we tell ourselves about who we are and all the things associated with that. And for a lot of people, that's uncomfortable. And we have data ourselves in work that we've done, where using our Healthy Minds program with beginning meditators who've never meditated before, we often see after the first week or so of them just cultivating awareness that they actually become more anxious. They report more anxiety. And we think it's not that they're actually experiencing more anxiety, but they're noticing what's going on in their mind. And what's going on in their mind often is quite chaotic, and simply becoming more aware of it makes them more anxious, or they perceive their anxiety more veridically for the first time. And so they're
More
reporting higher
accurately,
scores
which is to say.
more accurately. Yeah. So I think that one of the reasons why people try to find strategies to get rid of boredom is because the chaotic nature of their own mind is uncomfortable. And I actually think this is why people engage in certain kinds of leisure activities that are cognitively demanding, but that don't serve any other function other than their interesting leisure activities. For example, doing crossword puzzles or doing Sudoku. Um, there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time doing those things, and people report that they enjoy it. And I think they enjoy it because it transiently blocks the default mode. It transiently engages other parts of their mind so they are not aware of the self-referential activity. They're not aware of the narrative that is going on in the background.
I'm curious, one thing I'd love to unpack from a scientific point of view is the relationship with these brain networks, specifically with the default mode network that you talked about, and the rest of the nervous system. Because if I think back to, my teenage self sitting on the couch, which to me is like the most intensely bored I can remember feeling in my life, I think at that time I was completely oblivious to what was going on in my mind. So when I remember that, I actually don't remember the thought activity. Now, having meditated, I'm sure it was going on, but I just didn't know how to even attend to what was going on in my mind. But what I do remember is the physicality. There was almost this charge of restless energy, like I needed to release the energy and that it just had nowhere to go, and you're kind of just like this ball of energy, and yet it's like you're trying to constrain a ball of energy that's like trying to get out, and there's just no release for it. And I'm wondering, I'm imagining there's all sorts of things going on in the brain and the nervous system, and it points to the relationship between thought activity, which can be completely subterranean at times, like we're not even really aware of all the thought activity, and the way in which you kind of have this bidirectional relationship with emotional experiences, all this kind of physical experience. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit too, because boredom, I think the felt experience of it is oftentimes a very physical experience in a way.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's so interesting. And, when I think back to my childhood, during those periods, I got on my bicycle.
That's what I should
And
have done, probably.
and I developed a lifelong habit, which I still do, of riding my bicycle. And I would just, jump on my bike. And I grew up in New York City, and for me, um, my bicycle was liberating because
Amazing.
I rode all over the Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn and rode over the Brooklyn Bridge to go to Manhattan
Mm.
all the time. This was before, I had permission to go on the subway by myself, but I can go on my bicycle.
You
My
could
parents
ride
didn't
across the
really know,
Brooklyn Bridge.
yeah,
That's right.
didn't really know where I was, and I just went. So I just explored all over. So that was important for me. And I also felt a kind of somatic restlessness, but I was able to deal with it through physical activity. But, getting back to the essence of your question, I think that it is certainly the case, and we're learning more and more about it now, that there is bidirectional communication between the brain and the body. And we know that there are certain networks in the brain that communicate with the body, and activity in the brain will be in part expressed through the body, through changes in both the autonomic nervous system as well as the skeletal muscular system, through muscle tension and things of that sort. And so one of the signs of anxiety is increased muscle tension. And you can measure that with electromyography. It's a way to measure the electrical activity of muscles non-invasively in the same way we measure the electrical activity of the brain. We can put sensors on muscles that are in different parts of the body, and there is indeed activation in these muscles that are associated with anxiety. And so when we're bored, I think we notice this muscle activity more because there's no competing demand for our mind, and our awareness might be pulled to those places where the signal is the strongest. And there may be a lot of signal in the body. And I think, particularly for boys growing up, and the idea, it never made sense to me that kids were expected to sit at desks for the majority of the day in school. I mean, it just seems so inconsistent
Yeah,
with
it's like a recipe. It's like a boredom inducement, as though you were designing a system to make kids restless and bored.
right. And to sort of designing a system that seems inconsistent with their developmental stage. They
Yeah.
need to move.
Yeah. I mean, it
Um,
certainly was for me. I mean, it was like torture having to sit for hours on end, not moving.
yeah. So I think that also plays into this. But
Right.
when we begin to notice our body, it's the somatic parallel to noticing the chaotic nature of our mind. And so, you were saying that you didn't really notice a lot of anxious thoughts, but you did feel a lot of pent up activity in your body. And I think for young kids, the somatic representation is particularly important.
Yeah. And it's a great entry point too, because from a practice point of view, like what do you do with that? What would be the inner skill set to shift that dynamic and to work with it in a more healthy way? A lot of it, I think, is the physicality and the somatic aspect of it. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how each of us has practiced with this. I think one of the gifts of meditation practice is that I think it's almost impossible to have a meditation practice in which you don't have to really grapple with boredom, because you're literally sitting doing nothing for long periods of time. Like that is basically what you're doing. And so sleepiness and lethargy, which is strangely painful when you really can't escape it. I think anybody who experiences jet lag knows that well. It's like almost physically painful when you're just exhausted and yet there's nowhere to go and nothing to do with it. And then boredom equally, when there's no escape hatch, so to speak. So maybe we could talk about that. And maybe just one little entry point into this is that I noticed there's kind of a Gen Z meme going around where I think you can see, younger generations these days who have grown up with devices in their hands and who have very little experience with sitting with the discomfort of boredom. Equally, we could have a whole nother topic on social discomfort. The fact that you can look at your phone, I think, is also an escape hatch for social discomfort. And in a way, it makes us less resilient because you just don't have to deal with that discomfort. And therefore, when it happens, you're almost unprepared. You just haven't developed the muscle memory to do that. But with boredom specifically, there's this meme. I won't use the term because it's actually quite profane, but basically, it's just like sitting doing nothing. Like put your phone down and just sit there. And there's all sorts of discussion about the benefits of doing that as like this unfamiliar territory. I mean, for us growing up, this was like we had no choice but to sit and do nothing at times. But it's interesting that I think there's a recognition that unplugging and just dealing with the discomfort of not being plugged in all the time actually is a pretty helpful and important thing. But we can maybe each share our practice experience with this. What have you found helpful and how have you worked with
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of riffing off what you just said, Court, there are times, and this happens virtually every day for me. There are times I might be waiting on a line. it could be waiting to get coffee somewhere or waiting for my wife to, we're going out together. It may be me going downstairs and I'm just waiting a few minutes where I will notice, I have a period, it might just be as short as 2 or 3 minutes, where there's nothing scheduled and I feel the urge to take out my phone. And I notice the urge and I just say, okay, I'm not going to take out my phone. I'm just going to sit here and be aware. I'll be aware of the urge. I'll be aware of my body. I might be able to go outside and just feel the fresh air, and just enjoy this few minutes of awareness. And it's an intentional choice. And I have, at least a couple of those every single day where I notice, during an interstitial period where there's nothing, that I'm just waiting for something. There's an urge to pull out the phone because that's what we do during these times in our modern society. And I make an intentional choice to let it stay in my pocket. And, it's gotten to the point where, it's a little moment of celebration that, I still have enough residual self control to resist this, and then enjoy that moment of awareness.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, very similar with me, and to the point where it's become clear to me that you can actually train yourself so that the impulse and the urge actually sparks awareness, and equally could spark
Exactly.
other things too. But
Exactly.
for me too, also awareness is kind of the go-to practice. It's the easiest entry point. So it's almost like you rewire yourself so that you feel that urge, and then immediately on the heels of that, it's like, oh, I don't have to. I don't like that's not a fulfilling experience. I know what it feels like to always do that, and I'm going to just do something else. And so similarly, I think that's what I do as well. Another thing that I do is almost like a preemptive strike on that habit, which is knowing that there's certain times when that tends to happen, and just will intentionally leave my phone somewhere else. So it's just not like I don't even like, I know when the space opens up, I won't even have it next to me. I would like literally have to go to a different room or something. So the example I've given many times is the urge to pick it up first thing in the morning or to be looking at my phone when I go to bed. And I just made a decision to just leave my phone in my office. So oftentimes when I finish work before dinner, I'll just put my phone on its stand in my office, which is a room I don't usually go into after dinner, and then I don't, it's just not even in my orbit, but I still notice those urges. And then it's kind of like, oh, where's my phone? And then I remember it's in the office, and I'm certainly not going to like get up, and go somewhere just for that purpose alone. And there's two things that I found really helpful in terms of what to do in that space. One is I've done a lot of just using the breath as a support for awareness, and mindful breathing has always been a part of my practice since my early days as a meditator. And that kind of restless energy, sometimes I'll just take a few deep breaths and it just settles the mind. And that's really helpful. Sometimes I really love to pay attention to the restless energy itself, like the energy of the urge, the energy of the impulse, and not even trying to change it or to dampen it. But as we kind of started this with, boredom is kind of interesting as an experience. It's painful when we're trying to avoid it. The pain is actually is the impulse to escape the discomfort. But when you're like, oh, what actually is boredom? Like, where do you feel boredom? And I can tell you exactly where I feel boredom. Like, I feel a kind of it feels almost like a buzzing energy, and then I notice it's almost like a movement impulse. There's something that it feels like it's, my premotor cortex is firing. It's almost like this feeling of like I need to move in some way, but it's almost like the precursor to movement. It's like the impulse to move somehow, and you can almost feel the body is like mobilizing. But somehow it's the fact that you're not in a situation where I'm gonna like open the door and run down the street. It's sort like a mismatch between the context where movement is required, but that impulse is there. And it's the mismatch that somehow creates this weird discomfort I've noticed in my own experience. But
Yeah.
when I pay attention to it, it's weird because it's the feeling of boredom, but the mind is interested. So
Yeah.
usually those things you would think they're mutually exclusive. Like you can't feel bored and be interested. Like one is the absence of the other. But I can tell you, you can very much experience them at the same time. I mean, maybe it ceases to be boredom at that time, but some elements, it's like the residue of boredom is still there, but you're kind of fascinated by it. So I don't know. It's
Yeah.
very interesting
Yeah,
when
no,
you
I
look at it.
think that, yeah, like the somatic residue is still there. But you change the mindset, and you can also examine who is it that's
Yeah,
feeling this boredom, uh, and that's could be very helpful too.
totally. That one I do in retreat. I do that every time there's a hint of boredom. That's, I would say, my go-to practice. And oftentimes it's almost like even what is boredom and who's experiencing it, and then I feel like I don't find anything. It's like it's there one moment, and the moment I look, it's like, where did that go? Like somehow that has a almost a totally different effect where it seems like it's there, and then it's just ethereal. It's suddenly just like poof. It just somehow.
Yeah, yeah, I experience that when I'm actually sitting meditating. If I have boredom, or it's very similar with sleepiness, just really looking at it and with curiosity, who is actually sleepy, and then it just goes, it changes without trying to fix it. It's not like I'm trying to get rid of sleepiness. No, I'm really interested in what is sleepiness, how does it
Yeah.
feel. uh
Yeah, okay, that's it. We need there's a pin in sleepiness. We need to do an episode on sleepiness too, because that is yet another one that is so painful when you're trying to avoid it. And as a meditator, it's really painful to avoid sleepiness. It becomes this little spiral where you're just trying to avoid something that you're feeling, and it's hard to get out of it. But when you turn towards it, it's fascinating. So boredom, equally. I mean, I think we talked about awareness, and even the last point I think is more of an insight practice. It's kind of getting curious and digging into either what is boredom, like kind of unpacking the different dimensions of it, or I think as you're saying, Richie, even who is it that's experiencing emptiness? This gets into a very Buddhist kind of deconstruction of the self, which is incredibly interesting and powerful. And it just completely turns the table on boredom because suddenly it's fascinating. Like, and you can use these little moments where you're waiting for a cup of coffee at the coffee shop, or you're stuck somewhere, or you're waiting for your friend or partner to go somewhere, and there's just 2 minutes and you're sitting there. Suddenly, all those moments become interesting and they become meaningful rather than you need to find some way to escape it. It becomes kind of a beautiful thing in life. So, any final thoughts before we sign off on this one?
I think we uh covered this in a nice way, so yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, to everyone watching, if you have not tried this for yourself, this is maybe less interesting theoretically, but super interesting experientially if you actually try some of these techniques. So I highly recommend a little inner exploration with this one if it's not already on your inner roadmap. So thank you again for joining us, for tuning in. Hopefully you found something helpful here, and we'll see you soon in another episode of Dharma Lab.
Thank you.